The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. This is episode 5 of Death Comes for the Archbishop, and today we finish book 3. Bishop Latour continues his travels with Jacinto, and later hears the tale of one of the more despicable early missionaries in the region. Later in the program, Dr. John Pinheiro and I finish our conversation about American attitudes towards Catholics in 19th century America. But first, Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Chapter 3, The Rock.
After early Mass the next morning, Father Latour and his guide rode off across the low plain that lies between Laguna and Acoma. In all his travels, the bishop had seen no country like this. From the flat red sea of sand rose great rock mesas, generally Gothic in outline, resembling vast cathedrals. They were not crowded together in disorder, but placed in wide spaces, long vistas between. This place might once have been an enormous city, all the small quarters destroyed by time, only the public buildings left, piles of architecture that were like mountains. The sandy soil of the plain had a light sprinkling of junipers, and was splotched with masses of blooming rabbit brush, that olive-colored plant that grows in high waves like a tossing sea, at this season covered with a thatch of bloom, yellow as gorse or orange like marigolds. This mesa plain had an appearance of great antiquity and of incompleteness, as if, with all the materials for world-making assembled, the Creator had desisted, gone away, and left everything on the point of being brought together, on the eve of being arranged into mountain, plain, plateau. The country was still waiting to be made into a landscape. Ever afterward, the bishop remembered his first ride to Acoma as his introduction to the mesa country. One thing which struck him at once was that every mesa was duplicated by a cloud mesa, like a reflection which lay motionless above it or slowly moved up from behind it. These cloud formations seemed to be always there, however hot and blue the sky. Sometimes they were flat terraces, ledges of vapor. Sometimes they were dome-shaped or fantastic, like the tops of silvery pagodas, rising one above the other, as if an oriental city lay directly behind the rock. The great tables of granite set down in an empty plain were inconceivable without their attendant clouds, which were part of them, as the smoke is part of the censer or the foam of the wave. Coming along the Santa Fe Trail in the vast plains of Kansas, Father Latour had found the sky more a desert than the land, a hard, empty blue, very monotonous to the eyes of a Frenchman. But west of the Picos that all changed. Here there was always activity overhead, clouds forming and moving all day long. Whether they were dark and full of violence or soft and white with luxurious idleness, they powerfully affected the world beneath them. The desert, the mountains, and mesas were continually reformed and recolored by the cloud shadows. The whole country seemed fluid to the eye under this constant change of accent, this ever-varying distribution of light. Jacinto interrupted these reflections by an exclamation. "Acoma!" He stopped his mule. The bishop, following with his eye the straight, pointing Indian hand, saw far away 2 great mesas. They were almost square in shape, and at this distance seemed close together, though really they were some miles apart. "The far one," his guide still pointed. The bishop's eyes were not so sharp as Jacinto's, but now, looking down upon the top of the farther mesa from the highland on which they halted, he saw a flat white outline on the gray surface, a white square made up of squares. That, his guide said, was the pueblo of Acoma. Riding on, they presently drew rein under the enchanted mesa, and Jacinto told him that on this, too, there had once been a village, but the stairway which had been the only access to it was broken off by a great storm many centuries ago, and its people had perished up there from hunger. But how, the bishop asked him, did men think of living at the top of naked rocks like these, hundreds of feet in the air without soil or water? Jacinto shrugged. A man can do a whole lot when they hunt him day and night like an animal. Navajos on the north, Apaches on the south. The Acoma run up a rock to be safe. All this plain, the bishop gathered, had once been the scene of a periodic manhunt. These Indians, born in fear and dying by violence for generations, had at last taken this leap away from the earth, and on that rock they had found the hope of all suffering and tormented creatures, safety. They had come down to the plain to hunt and grow their crops, but there was always a place to go back to. If a band of Navajo were on the Acoma Trail, there was still one hope if he could reach his rock, sanctuary. On the winding stone stairway up the cliff, the handful of men could keep off a multitude. The rock of Acoma had never been taken by foe but once, by Spaniards in armor. It was very different from a mountain fastness, more lonely, more stark and grim, more appealing to the imagination. The rock, when one came to think of it, was the utmost expression of human need. Even mere feeling yearned for it. It was the highest comparison of loyalty and love and friendship. Christ himself had used that comparison for the disciple to whom he gave the keys of his church, and the Hebrews of the Old Testament, always being carried captive into foreign lands, their rock was an idea of God, the only thing their conquerors could not take from them. Already the bishop had observed in Indian life a strange literalness, often shocking and disconcerting. The Acoma, who must share the universal human yearning for something permanent, enduring, without shadow of change, they had their idea in substance. They actually lived upon their rock, were born upon it, and died upon it. There was an element of exaggeration in anything so simple. As they drew near the Acoma Mesa, dark clouds began boiling up from behind, like ink spots spreading in a brilliant sky. "Rain come," marked Jacinto. "This is good. They will be well disposed." He left the mules in a state corral at the foot of the mesa, took up the blankets, and hurried Father Latour into the narrow crack in the rock where the craggy edges formed a kind of natural stairway up the cliff. Wherever the footing was treacherous, it was helped out by little handholds, grounded into the stone like smooth mittens. The mesas were absolutely naked of vegetation, but at its foot a rank plant grew conspicuously out of the sand, a plant with big white blossoms like Easter lilies. By its dark blue-green leaves, large and coarse-toothed, Father Latour recognized the species of the Noxious datura. The size and luxuriance of these nightshades astonished him. They looked like great artificial plants, made of shining silk. When they were ascending the rock, deafening thunder broke over their heads, and the rain began to fall as if it were spilled from a cloudburst. Drawing into the deep twist of the stairway under an overhanging ledge, they watched the water shaken in heavy curtains in the air before them. In a moment the seam in which they stood was like the channel of a brook. Looking out over the great plain spotted with mesas and glittering with rain sheets, the bishop saw the distant mountains bright with sunlight. Again, he thought that the first creation morning might have looked like this, when the dry land was first drawn up out of the deep, and all was confusion. The storm was over in half an hour. By the time the bishop and his guide reached the last turn on the trail and rose to the crack, stepping out on the flat top of the rock, the noontide sun was blazing down upon Acoma with almost insupportable brightness. The bare stone floor of the town and its deep, warm paths were washed white and clean, and those depressions in the surface, which the Acoma call their cisterns, were full of fresh rainwater. Already the women were bringing out their clothes to begin washing. The drinking water was carried up the stairway in earthen jars on the heads of women from a secret spring below, but for all other purposes the people depended on the rainfall held in these cisterns. The top of the mesa was about 10 acres in extent, the bishop judged, and there was not a tree or a blade of grass upon it, not a handful of soil, except the churchyard, held in by an adobe wall, where the earth for burial had been carried up in baskets from the plain below. The white dwellings, 2 and 3-storied, were not scattered, but huddled together in a close cluster, with no protecting slope of ground or shoulder of rock, lying flat against the flat, bright against the bright. Both the rock and the plastered houses threw off the sun glare blindingly. At the very edge of the mesa, overhanging the abyss, so that its retaining wall was like a part of the cliff itself, was the old warlike church of Acoma, with its 2 stone towers. Gaunt, grim, gray, its nave rising some 70 feet to a sagging, half-ruined roof, it was more like a fortress than a place of worship. That spacious interior depressed the bishop as no other mission church had done. He held a service there before midday, and he had never found it so hard to go through the ceremony of the Mass. Before him, on the gray floor, in the gray light, a group of bright shawls and blankets, some 50 or 60 silent faces, above and behind them the gray walls. He felt as if he were celebrating Mass at the bottom of the sea. For antediluvian creatures, for types of life so old, so hardened, so shut within their shells, that the sacrifice on Calvary could hardly reach back so far. Those shell-like backs behind him might be saved by baptism and divine grace, as undeveloped infants are, but hardly through any experience of their own, he thought. When he blessed them and sent them away, it was with a sense of inadequacy and spiritual defeat. After he had laid aside his vestments, Father Latour went over the church with Jacinto. As he examined it, his wonder grew. What need had there ever been for this great church at Acoma? It was built in early 1600 by Fray Juan Ramirez, a great missionary who labored on the rock of Acoma for 20 years or more. It was Father Ramirez, too, who made the mule trail down the other side, the only path by which a burro can ascend the mesa, and which is still called El Camino del Padre. The more Father Latour examined this church, the more he was inclined to think that Fray Ramirez, or some Spanish priest who followed him, was not altogether innocent of worldly ambition, and that they built for their own satisfaction, perhaps, rather than according to the needs of the Indians. The magnificent site, the natural grandeur of this stronghold, might well have turned their heads a little. Powerful men they must have been, those Spanish fathers, to draft Indian labor for this great work without military support. Every stone in that structure, every handful of earth, and those many 1,000 pounds of adobe, was carried up the trail on the backs of men and boys and women. And the great carved beams of the roof, Father Latour looked at them with amazement. In all the plain through which he had come, he had seen no trees, but a few stunted piñons. He asked Jacinto where these huge timbers might have been found. San Mateo Mountain, I guess. But the San Mateo Mountains must be 40 or 50 miles away. How could they bring such timbers? Jacinto shrugged. Acoma carry. Certainly there was no other explanation. Besides the church proper, there was the cloister, large, thick-walled, which must have required an enormous labor of portage from the plain. The deep cloister corridors were cool when the rock outside was blistering. The low arches open on an enclosed garden, which, judging from the depth of its earth, must once have been very verdant. Pacing those shady passages with 4 feet of solid windowless adobe, shutting out everything but the green garden and the turquoise sky above, the early missionaries might well have forgotten the poor Acoma, that tribe of ancient rock turtles, and believed themselves in some cloister hung on a spur of the Pyrenees. In the great dust of the enclosed garden, 2 thin, half-dead peach trees, still struggling with the drought, the kind of unlikely tree that grows up from an old root and never bears. By the wall, yellow suckers put out from an old vine stump, very thick and hard, which must have once have borne its ripe clusters. Built upon the northeast corner of the cloister, the bishop found a loggia, roofed with open sides, looking down on the white pueblo with the tawny rock and over the wide plain window. There he decided he would spend the night. From this loggia he watched the sun go down, watched the desert become dark, the shadows creep upward. Abroad, in the plain, the scattered mesa tops, red with the afterglow, one by one lost their light, like candles going out. He was on a naked rock in the desert, in the Stone Age, a prey to homesickness for his own kind, his own epoch, for European man and his glorious history of desire and dreams. Through all the centuries that his own part of the world had been changing like the sky at daybreak, this people had been fixed, increasing neither in numbers nor desires, rock turtles on their rock. Something reptilian, he felt here, something he had endured by immobility, a kind of life out of reach, like the crustaceans in their armor. On his homeward way, the bishop spent another night with Father Jesus, the good priest at Isleta, who talked much with him about the Moqui country and of those very old rock-set pueblos still farther to the west. One story related to a long-forgotten friar at Acoma, and was somewhat as follows.
Chapter 4. The Legend of Fray Baltazar.
Sometime in the very early years of 1700, nearly 50 years after the great Indian uprising, in which all the missionaries and all the Spaniards in northern New Mexico were either driven out or murdered, after the country had been reconquered and new missionaries had come to take the place of the martyrs, a certain Friar Baltazar Montoya was a priest at Acoma. He was of a tyrannical and overbearing disposition and bore a hard hand on the natives. All the missions now in ruins were active then. Each had its resident priest, who lived for the people or upon the people, according to his nature. Friar Baltazar was one of the most ambitious and exacting. It was his belief that the pueblo of Acoma existed chiefly to support its fine church, and that this should be the pride of the Indians as it was his. He took the best of their corn and beans and squashes for his table, and selected the choicest portions when they slaughtered a sheep, chose their best hides to carpet his dwelling. Moreover, he exacted a heavy tribute and labor. He was never done with having earth carried up from the plain in baskets. He enlarged the churchyard and made the deep garden in the cloister, enriching it with dung from the corals. Here he was able to grow a wonderful garden, since it was watered every morning by women, and this despite the fact that it was not proper that a woman should ever enter the cloister at all. Each woman owed the padre so many ollas of water each week from the cisterns, and they murmured not only because of the labor, but because of the drain on their water supply. Baltazar was not a lazy man, and in his first years there, before he became stout, he made long journeys in behalf of his mission and his garden. He went as far as Oraibi, many days' journey to select their best peach seeds. The peach orchards at Oraibi were very old, having been cultivated since the days of the earliest Spanish expeditions, when Coronado's captains gave the Moquis peach seeds brought from Spain. His grape cuttings were brought from Sonora in baskets on muleback, and he would go all the way to the villa, Santa Fe, for choice garden seeds, at the seasons when pack trains came up the Rio Grande Valley. The early churchmen did a great business in carrying seeds about, though the Indians and Mexicans were satisfied with beans and squashes and chili, asking nothing more. Friar Baltazar was from a religious house in Spain which was noted for good living, and he himself had worked in the refectory. He was an excellent cook and something of a carpenter, and he took a great deal of trouble to make himself comfortable upon that rock at the end of the world. He drafted 2 Indian boys into his service, one to care for his ass and work in the garden, the other to cook and wait upon him at table. In time, he grew more unwieldy in figure. He adopted a 3rd boy and employed him as his runner to the distant missions. This boy would go on foot all the way to the villa for red cloth or an iron spade or a new knife, stopping at Mernalillo to bring home a wineskin full of grape brandy. He would go 5 days' journey to the Sandia Mountains to catch fish or dry and salt them for the padres' fast days, or run to Zunyi, where the fathers raised rabbits, and bring back a pear for the spit. His errands were seldom of an ecclesiastical nature. It was clear that the friar at Acoma lived more after the flesh than after the spirit. The difficulty of obtaining an interesting and varied diet on a naked rock seemed only to whet his appetite and tempt his resourcefulness. But his sensuality went no further than his garden and table. Carnal commerce with the Indian women would have been very easy indeed, and the friar was at the hardy age of ripe manhood when such temptations are peculiarly sharp. But the missionaries had early discovered that the slightest departure from chastity greatly weakened their influence and authority with their Indian converts. The Indians themselves sometimes practiced continence as a penance, or as a strong medicine with the spirits, and they were very willing that their padre should practice it for them. The consequences of carnal indulgence were perhaps more serious here than in Spain, and Friar Baltazar seems never to have given his flock an opportunity to exult over his frailty. He held his seat at Acoma for nearly 15 prosperous years, constantly improving his church and his living quarters, growing new vegetables and medicinal herbs, making soap from the yucca root. Even after he became stout, his arms were strong and muscular, his fingers clever. He cultivated his peach trees and watched over his garden like a little kingdom, never allowing the native women to grow slack in the water supply. His first serving boys were released to marry, and others succeeded them, who were even more minutely trained. Baltazar's tyranny grew little by little, and the Acoma people were sometimes at the point of revolt. But they could not estimate just how powerful the Padre's magic might be, and were afraid to put it to the test. There was no doubt that the holy picture of St. Joseph had come to them from the King of Spain by the request of this Padre, and that picture had been more effective in averting drought than all the native rainmakers had been. Properly entreated and honored, the painting had never failed to produce rain. Acoma had not lost its crop since Friar Baltazar first brought the picture to them, though at Laguna and Zunyi there had been droughts that compelled the people to live upon their famine store, an alarming extremity. The Laguna Indians were constantly sending legations to Acoma to negotiate terms at which they could rent the holy picture, but Friar Baltazar had warned them never to let it go. If such powerful protection were withdrawn, or the Padre should turn the magic against them, the consequences might be disastrous to the pueblo. Better give him his choice of grain and lambs and pottery, and allow him his 3 serving boys. So the missionaries and his converts rubbed along in seeming friendliness. One summer the friar, who did not make long journeys now that he had grown large in girth, decided that he would like company, someone to admire his fine garden, his ingenious kitchen, his airy loggia with its rugs and water jars, where he meditated and took his after-dinner siesta. So he planned to give a dinner party in the week after St. John's Day. He sent his runner to Zunyi, Laguna, Isleta, and bade the Padres to a feast. They came upon the day, 4 of them, for there were 2 priests at Zunyi. The stable boy was stationed at the foot of the rock to take their beasts and conduct the visitors up the stairway. At the head of the trail, Baltazar received them. They were shown over the place, and spent the morning gossiping in the cloister walks, cool and silent, though the naked rock outside was almost too hot for the hand to touch. The vine leaves rustled agreeably in the breeze, and the earth about the carrot and onion tops, as it dried from last night's watering, gave off a pleasant smell. The guests thought their host lived very well, and they wished they had his secret. If he was a trifle boastful of his air-bound seat, no one could blame him. With the dinner, Baltazar had taken extravagant pains. The monastery in which he had learned to cook was off the main highway to Seville. The Spanish nobles and the king himself sometimes stopped there for entertainment. In that great kitchen, with its multiplicity of spits, small enough to roast a lark and large enough to roast a boar, the friar had learned a thing or two about sauces, and in his lonely years at Acoma he had bettered his instruction by a natural aptitude for the art. The poverty of materials had proved an incentive rather than a discouragement. Certainly the visiting missionaries, who had never sat down to food like which rejoiced them today in the cool refectory, the blinds opened just enough to admit a streak of throbbing desert far from below. Their host was telling them pompously that he would have a fountain in the cloister when they came again. He had to check his hungry guests and their zeal for the relishes and soup, warning them to save their mettle for what was to come. The roast was to be a wild turkey, superbly done, but that, alas, was never tasted. The course which preceded it was the host's especial care, and here he had trusted nothing to his cook. Herr Jardinier, his carrots and onions were tender and well-flavored, with a sauce that he had been perfecting for many years. This entree was brought from the kitchen in a large earthen dish, but not large enough, for with its luxury of sauces and floating carrots, it filled the platter to the brim. The stable boy was serving today, as the cook could not leave his spits, and he had been neat, brisk, and efficient. The friar was pleased with him and was wondering whether he could not find some little medal of bronze or silver gilt to reward him for his pains. When the hare in its sauce came out, the priest from Isleta chanced to be telling a funny story at which the company were laughing uproariously. The serving boy, who knew a little Spanish, was apparently trying to get to the point of the recital which made the padre so merry. At any rate, he became distracted, and as he passed behind the senior priest of Zunyi, he tipped his full platter and spilled a stream of rich brown gravy over the good man's head and shoulders. Baltazar was quick-tempered, and he had been drinking freely of the fiery great brandy. He caught up the empty pewter mug at his right and threw it at the clumsy lad with a malediction. It struck the boy on the side of the head. He dropped the platter, staggered a few steps, and fell down. He did not get up, nor did he move. The padre from Zunyi was skilled in medicine. Wiping the sauce from his eyes, he bent over the boy and examined him. "Muerto," he whispered. With that, he plucked his junior priest by the sleeve, and the two bolted across the garden without another word and made for the head of the stairway. In a moment, the padres of Laguna and Isleta unceremoniously followed their example. With remarkable speed, the four guests got them down from the rock, saddled their mules, and urged them across the plain. Baltazar was left alone with the consequences of his haste. Unfortunately, the cook, astonished at the prolonged silence, had looked in the door just as the last pair of brown gowns were vanishing across the cloister. He saw his comrade lying upon the floor and silently disappeared from the premises by an exit only known to himself. When Friar Baltazar went into the kitchen, he found it solitary, the turkey still dripping on the spit. Certainly he had no appetite for the roast. He felt, indeed, very remorseful and uncomfortable, also indignant with his departed guests. For a moment he entertained the idea of following them, but a temporary flight would only weaken his position, and a permanent evacuation was not to be thought of. His garden was at its prime, his peaches were just coming ripe, and his vines hung heavy with green clusters. Mechanically he took the turkey from the spit, not because he had any inclination for food, but from an instinct of compassion, quite as if the bird could suffer from being burned to a crisp. This done, he repaired to his loggia, and sat down to read his breviary, which he had neglected for several days, having been so occupied in the refectory. He begrudged no pains to that sauce which had been his undoing. The airy loggia, where he customarily took his afternoon repose, was like a birdcage hung in the breeze. Through its open archways he looked down upon the huddled pueblo, and out over the great mesa-strewn plain far below. He was unable to fix his mind upon his office. The pueblo down there was much too quiet. At this hour there should be a few women washing pots or rags, a few children playing by the cisterns and chasing the turkeys. But today the rock top baked on the fire of the sun in utter silence. Not one human being visible. Yes, one, though he had not been there a moment ago. At the head of the stone stairway there was a patch of lustrous black just above the rocks, an Indian's hair. They had set a guard at the trailhead. Now the padre began to feel alarmed, to wish he had gone down that stairway with the others while there was still time. He wished he would be anywhere in the world but on this rock. There was old Father Ramirez's donkey path, but if the Indians were watching one road, they would watch the other. The spot of black hair never stirred, and there was but those two ways down to the plain, only those. Whichever way he turned, 350 feet of naked cliff, without one tree or shrub a man could cling to. As the sun sank lower and lower, there began a deep, singing murmur of male voices from the pueblo behind him. Not a chant, but the rhythmical intonation of Indian oratory when a serious matter is under discussion. Frightful stories of the torture of the old missionaries and the great rebellion of 1680 flashed into Friar Baltazar's mind. How one Franciscan had his eyes torn out, another had been burned, and the old padre at Yames had been stripped naked, driven on all fours about the plaza all night, while drunken Indians straddled his back until he rolled over dead from exhaustion. Moonrise from the loggia was an impressive sight, even to this brother who is not over-impressionable. But tonight he wished he could keep the moon from coming through the floor of the desert. The moon was the clock which began things in the pueblo. He watched with horror for that golden rim against the deep blue velvet of the night. The moon came, and at its coming the Acoma people issued from their doors. A company of men walked silently across the rock to the cloister. They came up the ladder and appeared in the loggia. The friar asked them gruffly what they wanted, but they made no reply. Not once speaking to him or to each other. They bound his feet and tied his arms to his sides. They carried him down the ladder through the cloister and across the rock to the most precipitous cliff, the one over which the Acoma woman flung broken pots and such refuse as the turkeys would not eat. There the people were assembled. They cut his bonds, and taking him by hands and feet, swung him over the rock edge and back a few times. He was heavy, and perhaps they thought this a dangerous sport. No sound but hissing breath came through their teeth. The 4 executioners took him up again from the brink of where they had laid him, and after a few feints, dropped him in midair. So did they rid their rock of their tyrant, whom on the whole they had liked very well. But everything has its day. The execution was not followed by any sacrilege to the church or defiling of holy vessels, but merely by a division of the padre's stores and household goods. The women indeed took pleasure in watching the garden pine and waste away from thirst, and ventured into the cloisters to laugh and chatter at the whitening foliage of the peach trees and the green grapes shriveling on the vines. When the next priest came, years afterward, he found no ill awaiting him. He was a native Mexican of unpretentious tastes who was well satisfied with beans and jerked meat, and let the Pueblo turkey flock scratched in the hot dust that had once been Baltazar's garden. The old peach stumps kept sending up pale sprouts for many years. Coming up.
In the end, the last conflict over religion was how to divide up church territory in the American Southwest, and whether you could have a diocese that might cross the border, or did you have to create a whole new diocese because of the ownership of the property.
Now this.
Support for this program comes from NordVPN, a provider of virtual private network services. NordVPN offers tools designed to encrypt internet traffic and route connections through remote servers, helping to enhance online privacy and reduce digital tracking. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/NordVPN.
Don't forget, you can get early ad-free access to each episode of Death Comes for the Archbishop by becoming a paying subscriber at purplecatholic.com. Welcome back to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. John Pinheiro, a historian and author. Dr. Pinheiro currently serves as Director of Research at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He is the author, most recently, of Missionaries of Republicanism, a religious history of the Mexican-American War.
Freedoms.
Let's go back a little bit back to the war. You have all this propaganda about Catholics coming from Beecher and others. Where did Catholics fall in the Mexican-American War? What were their attitudes towards the conflict, and were there Catholics or bishops or thinkers calling for or against it within the church?
Well, as it turns out, James K. Polk had a ward, his nephew, he didn't have his own children, who was a student at Georgetown College at the time. And the Catholic bishops just happened to be in town for their meeting at the start of the war. So President Polk met with Bishop John Hughes, he had been in Philadelphia during the riots, but by then he was the Archbishop of New York City. And he's the person who launched the building of St. Patrick's Cathedral at the time. And so he met with Hughes and he said, look, here's what I'm afraid of. The president said this. Here's what I'm afraid of. We're at this time of clearly rising anti-Catholicism and religious tension. We had riots just 2 years ago in Philadelphia. Now we're going to war against a Catholic country. I have a couple of concerns. One is that our soldiers are going to go into Mexico and cause so much damage and trouble if they bring this kind of religious bigotry with them, that this will turn into a religious war. And all I want to do is settle for a peace and annex this part of the country, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want a protracted conflict bogged down in religious tensions. So Hughes suggested that Polk send along a couple of chaplains. And so Polk sent 2 Catholic chaplains with the army. Both were Jesuits. One came back and founded Boston College. The other was killed by Mexicans in Mexico. The Jesuit order had been banned from Mexico like the rest of Spanish possessions in the 1700s and had recently been restored, but was not really back in Mexico at that time. So the other thing, though, there were Americans who questioned Catholic loyalty. So, and the complex factor was that the U.S. Army was very, very small because republics don't need big armies. And the expectation is that we volunteer in times of war to fight. And so a volunteer army was raised, and volunteer units were raised by their captains. And some of these captains lobbied for their election as captain by saying, "I'll take you to Mexico and we'll get some golden Jesuses." In other words, we're going to pilfer the place because everybody knows the Catholic Church is rich. Other companies were formed by, they were like all Irish and Catholic. And in the regular army, which was the U.S. Army, not the volunteer forces, the U.S. Army, some estimates are 1/2, some are 3 out of 5, but there were a lot of foreign-born men in the U.S. Army because it was a steady paycheck, and you immigrate, and you go right into the army. And many of those were Catholic. And they had faced anti-Catholicism in the army, being forced to attend Presbyterian services, punished more than other men for the same infraction. So there was some of that bigotry in the army as well. And the way the war would work is some of the volunteer units would be called up to go to Mexico. The regular units would be called up to go to Mexico. The volunteers were always less well-behaved than the regular soldiers. And inevitably, this spilled over into atrocities in Mexico and the ransacking of churches. At the same time, Polk told the army he wanted the soldiers to, as he called it, conspicuously respect the Mexicans' religion. So he was very, very conscious of the possibility of the American anti-Catholic sentiment spilling over and causing trouble in the war. But this backfired quite a bit because in one case, a colonel told all his soldiers to kneel during a procession in the streets. And this included Protestant soldiers, and violating their religious liberty. And so, but that came back to the States as this is what it would look like if we were a Catholic country. We'd all be forced at gunpoint to kneel to the host as it passes in the streets, that kind of thing. So in the end, the last conflict over religion was how to divide up church territory in the American Southwest, and whether you could have a diocese that might cross the border, or did you have to create whole new dioceses because of the ownership of the property, because the property is in the hands of the bishop, right? He's technically the owner of the property of the diocese. So there was that complexity, and it was worked out in Congress, in fact. And that's a story I tell in the book because it's just a story nobody had told before. You can't imagine Congress spending several days on this aspect of a peace treaty, what it would mean to be Catholic in this territory, and worship and Mexican citizenship. And are the people there citizens? You're a Republican. You just conquered a third of the country next door. Are they citizens? Are they slaves? What are they? And so they had to work that out in the treaty deliberations. Polk was roundly criticized for sending the Jesuit chaplains of all people. You pick the religious order most hated by the anti-Catholic forces in the country, and that's who you sent. But Bishop Hughes, I think it was during the war, shortly before, he even opened Congress with an invocation. Okay. So you don't want to get the impression that anti-Catholicism's everywhere, but it certainly provided the vocabulary that nearly everyone used to talk about Mexico and what was wrong with it.
Let's talk a little bit about that peace deliberations where you mentioned the diocese and the territory there. In the novel that we're going through here, Death Comes for the Archbishop, you kind of hear that, well, they're creating this new diocese, we need a bishop, and they plot Father Latour over there as to be the first bishop of Santa Fe. In reality, what did those deliberations look like?
On the part of the church?
On the part of the church, and then you had mentioned the American government as you're working out that border there.
On the part of the American government, so the Senate is charged with treaty making. So the treaty that was made in Mexico was sent to the Senate. They started chopping away at it. There were several paragraphs in this one article of the treaty dealing with religious liberty. And finally what happened is that was whittled down to just a few sentences that just talked about religion without restriction. That is, there be no restriction on religion in the area. So the concern was if would the Catholics suppress the Protestants? Would the Protestants come in and punish the Catholics? And how is this going to look? And so the diocesan boundaries were drawn. It was what was going to be the new border. But there was a move to conquer all of Mexico, and there were missionaries, Protestant missionaries with their Bibles, who went into Mexico in the wake of the army. They thought this is what the war was going to allow them to do. But once the treaty was passed, that all came to an end rather quickly. Mm-hmm. As far as from the church's standpoint, I don't know as much about that, and that's not quite in my book. But I've read the novel you're talking about, which is excellent. And there's a couple of good books out there worth reading. One is called Wake for a Fat Vicar, and it's about Archbishop Lamy, who was one of the bishops who went into that area. And the other is a new biography of Father Francisco Garces by Jeremy Beer. I'm actually reading that right now. So I've been reading a lot about Mexico and its northern frontier during the 1700s. And Father Garces, who was a very prominent name where I grew up in California, and was very prominent out there with Father Junipero Serra as well. And the challenges there is that the Jesuits had been banned in the 1700s. They had established schools, hospitals, settlements to protect the Indians from the Spanish settlers. When they were kicked out, the Franciscans moved in. Then Mexico kicked out the Franciscans. So Mexico nationalized the missions of California. And one of the oddities of the war is that it's the Protestant United States that returned the California missions to the Catholic Church. They had been taken by the Mexican government. And that's one of these great ironies of this war that starts to feed into a little bit of a different understanding of what religious liberty really looks like, and what some of these, I could only call them integralist Catholic states, look like, where there's only one religion and it's a Catholic Church, and the church thrown an altar is somehow tied together, or the altar and the government are tied together. And it is usually, historically, doesn't end up well for the church. We don't have to think about theory when we talk about this. The reality is it hasn't ended up well. Those missions are another good example. The church took a very low view, church officials took a very low view of the indigenous priesthood and saw them as uneducated and rather barbaric. And that's why you get Frenchmen and French clerics and foreign clerics from elsewhere sent into what was then the American Southwest. And the Jesuit chaplains who went with the army, one of them, Father McElroy wrote very disdainfully about Catholic practices among the Mexicans as well. If you were to take some of McElroy's letters home to his Jesuit superiors and didn't know a Jesuit was writing it, you would think it was some of the same anti-Catholic literature. And so there was this kind of looking down the nose at Indian and indigenous forms and practices of Catholicism. And there was quite a bit of many of the priests in Mexico were keeping concubines. I mean, there was a real mess that the chaplains encountered, and it scandalized the American Catholics who went in, and it certainly scandalized the American Protestants who went in. But then there was a lot they just didn't understand, and they were scandalized because there was too much incense, and there were rich men kneeling with poor men on the same floor before the Eucharist, and that scandalized them too, some of the Americans. But these are real scandals we're talking about here. So there's very much a Eurocentric view of how to clean up that mess, and that's why the bishops are coming from outside, and not even from a Spanish culture. Right.
So I know a lot of more. I don't want to use the word traditionalist necessarily, but there are a lot of Catholics now that would say that allegedly anti-Catholic bias has not totally gone away in this country, and in some ways I suppose it hasn't. But I obviously it's not the way it was when you had Beecher and you had the Mexican-American War. When do you think we started to see that fade in the United States?
Well, so it started to fade in the mid-20th century, in the 40s and 50s, with you have Fulton Sheen on TV, and Bing Crosby playing a priest in the movies, and Americans, along with the Knights of Columbus, who worked to put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, and so there's this sense that we're all Americans, etc. But actually, I think that started to decline already by the 60s and 70s. And Philip Jenkins wrote a book maybe 20 years ago called The New Anti-Catholicism. So I think there is the anti-Catholicism around nowadays. There is still chick publications and some odd evangelical subsets who this is just what they do. They talk about the Pope as the Antichrist all the time, and everything is idolatry. But most of the anti-Catholicism now comes from secular humanists and atheists, and those promoting the sexual revolution, and really what Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, talked about, just the truncation of reason. Reason is what's really under assault, and when you assault reason, you also assault the Catholic Church because of that synthesis of faith and reason. And so I would say anti-Catholicism is with us, but the purveyors of it are just different people.
Right.
And you see it in laws that restrict Catholic adoption agencies based on gender or other things. You see it in laws related to abortion and artificial contraception in Catholic hospitals. So it's definitely with us, but it's I don't think there's anyone who thinks that the Pope's the Pope's from America. Take that line, Beecher. But I don't think there's anybody who's too concerned about Rome picking up shop and taking over the Mississippi River.
Right.
But there's still you look in Hollywood movies, and
Sure.
if you're looking for a bad guy, even it's usually going to be a Catholic priest or a bishop or some creepy Gothic looking cathedral.
And it's so much more amplified by social media, X and Facebook and all of these other ones. It's just so much easier to spread that. And everyone who has we used to joke when I worked at Al Cresta Show that anyone on the internet's an expert because they can say whatever they want. What was the solution for? I mean, I know we're talking. I know we're a little bit out of the Mexican American. We're now talking about 20th century Catholicism in America and attitudes towards it. And you mentioned the Knights of Columbus, but are there other things? Maybe the way that the Church changed the way it spoke to the world after the Second Vatican Council. Do you think that helped with attitudes in the United States towards the Church?
It's hard to say. It seems to me that the Church was already at a high point of popularity and respect, and that it's only gotten worse. And I don't want to lay that at the foot of the Second Vatican Council necessarily, but certainly in the implementation of it, if your Catholic parish became less discernible from a Protestant Episcopal Church outside of the actual sacrifice of the Mass taking place, then that's problematic. The Land O'Lakes reducing Catholic universities to thinking that they have to compete with R1 institutions, and what that really means is playing down the faith. I mean, there's so much that occurred in the wake of the 1960s, much of which can be laid at the foot of the sexual revolution, I think. So the idea was that the Church, a la Leo XIII, would approach the modern world's problems, and that the Church really had something to say as the Church, as the bride of Christ. Whether it was the new things of the late 1800s, like industrialization and the problems with labor and capital, as Leo XIII says in Rerum Novarum, or whether it was socialism, which Leo condemned in Rerum Novarum because it attacked private property, which he called a fundamental human right. Not to own property, but to not have your property taken away from you, in other words, which is exactly what socialism does, and gives it to the government, which then doles it out. And so Leo had addressed many of those things. So did the popes of the 1930s, right? And so the complexity now is, if the Church is just going to speak as one voice among many, it really just gets drowned out. So that I think in some ways what the Church needs, this is just my opinion, right? I'm a guy who wrote a book on the Mexican-American War, but the Church is, without the mission of evangelization and spreading the gospel, the Church really isn't the Church. I mean, that's its mission. These other things enhance the mission, and they're part of the mission, but the mission of the Church is evangelization. It's to spread the gospel. It's to spread the good news. And a lot of that good news is about the human person, and I think that's what people need to hear now, that people matter, that we are each of us unique and created by God and distinguished from our fellow people, and that we're important, and that we were desired by God to exist, and that we find our ultimate existence in God because He created everything out of nothing, and that we're to be subjects in our own story and not the objects of pity, not the objects of a technocratic government trying to play us like a marionette or even a sexual object, but we're actually the subjects in our own tale. And so when the Church spends all its time talking about politics and nuclear weapons in the 1980s, I think it's just weakened the voice of the Church.
I got one final question for you, and it's going to sound a little bit out of left field, but here it goes. You used to teach at Aquinas College. I used to be there as a student. I think I had a couple classes with you. But my main major was political science. And one of the things that was drilled into my brain from some modern political scientists is that straight line borders are bad because they're artificially made. And I'm curious because when you look at a map of the American Southwest, you have a lot of straight line borders across where the United States annexed that part of Mexico. As a historian, what would your take be on straight line borders, either throughout history or even in this particular conflict?
Well, I mean, I think it just really matters. So, for instance, I have a straight line border with my neighbor, and we get along great. We don't even have a fence. We have a straight line border with the nation of Canada, and which has been for a very long time the longest, non-militarized, non-protected, etc. border in the world, and it's a straight line. There's a straight line between Alaska and Canada. There's a straight line between the northern lower continental states and Canada. In Mexico's case, that this is part of what the dispute was in the 1840s, that in order to build railroads through the rest of the Southwest, there was another chunk of land added in the early 1850s, the so-called Gadsden Purchase. So what's true is that natural borders help when nations despise each other. Over the mountains are the other people. We don't go over the mountains. We don't cross the river. It's hard to cross the river. I think those are less and less important in the modern era. And I would think where that applies more than anything is in Europe, post-European colonial Africa. That's where I would point to problematic straight line borders, and the placing of enemies with ancient tribal differences within the same borders. But even there, oftentimes it's a matter more of corrupt governments working in cronyism with certain groups or companies foreign to the nations in which they operate. And it's not so much ancient prejudices. That's just what they talk about, like it's ancient prejudices, but it's often just a corrupt elite siphoning off talent and wealth and resources from their own country. And it has less to do with a straight line border that put two tribal nations together than it does to have that corruption.
Right.
So that what these places need more than straight line borders, they need rule of law. And so when you don't have rule of law, you don't have the other things that come into play with human flourishing. There was just a few years ago, there was a statistical survey taken of business people in the United States and said, what's the most important thing in terms of your business success? And none of them mentioned the right to private property, and none of them mentioned rule of law, because in the United States, they just took it for granted.
Right.
But if you were to go to Africa and talk to budding entrepreneurs or wannabe entrepreneurs, what they'll tell you is that we don't want aid in your clothing dumped on us and ruining all of our local markets. What we need rule of law, so that when I go to start a business, it's not going to be taken away from me. I'm not going to have to pay off the local police and all the local licensing agencies, and it takes me 2 years just to get a business license to open a shop the size of a closet. They understand the need for the rule of law, but when you live in a mostly law-abiding society, then you can complain about corruption and cronyism. These are some of the things you just don't notice. It's like a fish not noticing it's in water, I guess.
Right. Dr. Pinheiro, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Next week, we read Book 4, and I expound on a letter from Pope Francis on the importance of literature. Lord willing, I will talk to you then. Goodbye.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.